In this first lecture, we're going to discuss classification, structure, and properties of timber. Trees are a valuable source of wealth, and their great value lies in the fact that they are incredibly versatile, they can be used for so many different things, and that they are a renewable resource. And of course, what that means is, when we harvest trees to use them, they grow back, and so we can use them again and again and again. Nothing historically has been so adaptable and of such immeasurable benefit to mankind as wood, with its infinite variety of types and uses. And again, let's just think about that. Of course, they get used widely in buildings, in housing, in shelter, but also in machines. And when we think about some of the earliest means of transportation, we could think about horse and cart, or even the basic wheel. Timber has had a role to play in all of those. To appreciate the properties of wood and how it is worked and finished, it is worthwhile to have an understanding of the way the tree grows. So the tree is unique in the plant kingdom for two main reasons, and for others as well. But its size and its longevity. So many species of trees live for hundreds of years, with some living specimens have been recorded to have lived in excess of 4,900 years. And trees are like all other plants in that they are dependent on the process of photosynthesis to produce new cells and subsequently growth. And this is where we need to sort of get into some fine details. So we've just mentioned photosynthesis, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And we've also mentioned this concept of cells. So that means that like any living thing that's made up of cells, so are trees. So the woody material in trees is made up from many elongated hollow cells packed closely together. And they're either joined end to end or they overlap slightly, obliquely. The structure of trees. So the growth in height is confined to specialized cells at the extreme tips of the tree and branches. So these cells are quite different to the other cells of the tree, and usually we don't use them at all when it comes to constructing or designing with timber. You can see in the image on the right hand side, those cells are right in the very middle, and they're called the pith, the heart of the tree. The thing that's important to note about those particular cells is that whilst they grow the tree in height or in length of branches, they're not very durable. So once they've kind of done their job and extended the height of the tree, they tend to die and they will rot out. And often what you'll find, particularly in older trees or in certain species, you'll find that the middle of the tree will rot out and will have a weak section there, or even a hole. So like I said, growth in height is confined to specialised cells at the extreme tips of the tree and branches. Growth in girth or diameter occurs in the cambium layer, which is located just underneath the bark, which is also sometimes called the cortex. Now this is where the kind of the structure of the tree develops. Now photosynthesis is a process of changing the basic raw materials, water and carbon dioxide, into food. And the food, which we will often call sap, consists of sugars and starches, and they're conducted to other parts of the trees via food-conducting cells located on the inner part of the bark, known as the phloem. So we've talked about the cambium layer and we've talked about the phloem, and those two layers are very, very close together. If we were to work from the outside in, we would say the bark is there on the outside, then just underneath that surface is the phloem, then just underneath that is the cambium layer, which is the new cells of the tree that are growing. So we've talked about the pith or medulla, and that's a cylinder of usually brown, soft and spongy tissue which extends throughout the centre of the trunk and branches. So they are those specific cells that grow in height and length, and then once they're covered by the cambium layer, they tend to rot out or die. The true wood or heartwood is the fully developed wood surrounding the pith. So it's towards the centre of the tree. It supports and gives rigidity to the tree. The sapwood is on the outside of the heartwood. It's the immature and newly matured woody tissue produced by the cambium layer. Now the sapwood, so when we're talking about this, the sapwood, that actually allows the sap to go from the roots up to the leaves. So the sap is basically water with some dissolved minerals, and that goes up to the leaves where photosynthesis takes place, and then the food comes down from the leaves all the way back down to the roots, and that provides food to the growing cells in the cambium layer, but also goes in via the medullary rays and keeps the sapwood alive as well. So again, the cambium layer is a thin layer of cells between the inner bark and the sapwood. That's the factory of the tree. The cambium cells divide and grow, producing woody cells on the inside. So that's the xylem. Now, again, we're using a lot of terms here. So xylem also can be called the sapwood. And the new inner bark cells on the outside, which are the phloem. So again, the phloem is where the food from the leaves flows down the inside of the bark, feeding the cambium cells and also feeding the roots. The bark or cortex is a layer of non-woody fibrous material surrounding the trunk and branches. It protects the tree from extremes of temperature, frost, fires, insects, fungi and animals. Now, as an aside, before there were chainsaws and tractors and things like that to do tree clearing with, one of the simplest ways to clear an area is a process called ring barking. And that's basically where you would cut the bark off all the way around the tree. And what it also would do is that would take out the phloem, and it would also take out the cambium layer. And that would literally stop the tree from growing and kill the tree. The medullary rays or rays are lines or bundles of thin-walled cells that run radially from the bark to the pith. So they basically run from the outside of the tree back into the inside of the tree. The growth rings are sheath or cone-like layers of wood formed each growing season. And I think most people are familiar with what growth rings can look like. But a growth ring consists of two parts. Consists of early wood, and that's the wood formed early in the growth period when the growth is rapid. So that's usually in the spring through to the early summer. And we're going to look at some microscopic pictures of that shortly, so you'll see what that can look like. And then there's the late wood, and that's the wood formed later in the growth period when conditions for growth are less favourable. So that's usually in the late summer into the autumn. And what you'll see there is you'll find that the cells are smaller and they're more closely packed together. And that's where you get the dark part of the ring. That's kind of the part of the ring that you can see. Now, again, we're just going to go back and talk about the medullary rays, and you can see them, examples of them over there in the image. And so they're there to transport food from the outside of the tree, so from the phloem, back in through the sapwood. So that keeps the sapwood alive. Now, we talked about heartwood and we talked about sapwood. And a really good way to sort of think about it is that all of the cells will have food or sap flowing through them. And like with any sort of thing like that, eventually it will build up on the inside of the cells or on the inside of the pores, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and it blocks them up. And a really good way to think about the difference between heartwood and sapwood is where the heartwood is where the pipes or the tubes in the cells have all become blocked, and so food is no longer getting to those sections of the tree, and so they're now effectively dead. Now you'll see here photos taken by a microscope that show us two species of timber and some various features of them. We're looking at the growth rings, but we're also able to see the medullary rays. So you'll see there, particularly in both the hackberry and the butternut hickory, you'll see in the early wood section, you'll see these holes. Now they are called pores. And in the early spring particularly, you'll see that they're quite large. And even the cells, which you've got to look in very closely to see them, but you'll see that the cells themselves are quite a bit larger. As you move out, the pores actually get smaller and smaller, and you can see right on the outside there's a very distinct line. And that's kind of when growth stops in the winter, and then it starts again. The other thing that you can see quite faintly, and you'll see these lines going vertically in both of these images, and they're the medullary rays. So, they're basically a line of cells growing from the outside of the tree back to the inside of the tree. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the classification of wood. So it's fairly commonly known that there's two main kinds, and we call them hardwoods and softwoods. Now, to some extent, hardwoods are generally harder than softwoods, but that's not always the case. So another way we can look at it is hardwoods are pored woods, where they have vessels or pores in them. Also, I like to call them basically pipes. And it's those pipes that transfer the sap through the tree. Whereas in softwoods, they're non-pored woods. You can consider each cell to be a little pipe or a little tube or a little straw even. And it's the individual cells that transfer the food or the sap through the tree. So that's one of the main differences, but we'll go into some of the other differences. So hardwoods are also known as angiosperms, as they are flowering plants with seeds encased in the fruit. A gumnut is a good example. They usually have broad flat leaves and can be either evergreen or deciduous. Timber from hardwood species is pored woods, where it contains pores or vessels, or as I like to call them, pipes. And examples are, all eucalypts, ash, walnut, balsa wood. And that's an interesting example because balsa would be considered to be quite light and soft. But the reason why is because in balsa, the vessels or the pores are very, very large in relation to the fibres. So it's the size of the vessels in relation to the fibres that makes balsa so light and soft. And other species are birch, elm and beech. Now softwoods are usually conifers or gymnosperms, which are non-flowering plants with naked seeds being formed in scaly cones, like pine cones. Nearly all softwoods are evergreen and have scale or needle-like leaves. Timber from softwood species is non-poured wood, so pines, firs, larch, spruce and cedar. Now when we look at the images over the other side, and again these are sort of drawings taken at a microscopic scale, there is a little bit of detail in there where you can actually see the pores in the timber. You can also see a little bit of difference there between early wood and late wood, particularly in the softwood example towards the top. You can actually see how the cells themselves, as they transfer from being early wood through to late wood, get smaller and smaller. You can also see ray parenchyma, which is another word for the medullary rays. So you can see how they work in the tree as well. So finally, the terms hardwood and softwood can cause some confusion as they do not bear much relation to the relative hardness or softness of the wood, but whether the timber possesses vessels or pores or not, as we've discussed. Okay, so now we'll talk about the properties of wood. And specifically, the properties when we talk about them, we need to sort of talk about them from the perspective of design in timber. There are some that are more or less relevant, and it will depend on what you're using the timber for. And I've put some examples there on the right-hand side. So the properties of timbers are determined by the structure of the wood and by the proportion of the various cell types present in the wood. So for example, some woods, oak in particular, has very, very large and pronounced medullary rays. That has implications when we think about how the timber moves. We're going to talk about that later. But also it has implications depending on how the timber is cut and then what it looks like as well. So the distribution and arrangement of these elements vary considerably in different species of trees. The selection of timbers for furniture depends mainly on the external appearance characteristics and the working qualities of the wood. But consideration must also be given to density, hardness, various strength properties, shrinkage, or I also like to call that movement, and durability. And we'll talk about all of these. So the appearance characteristics. So firstly, and this is probably one of the main ones that comes down to, when we select timber for timber projects, and that's the colour. What does it look like from the perspective of colour? So it depends on the substances and chemicals in the cells and the cell walls. For example, jarrah, which is quite rich and red, grows in soils rich in bauxite. And you can see there's a good example of it towards the top. You'll see the second one there is blackwood, and it can vary. Like that particular one is more on the red side. It can vary between dark browns, light browns, and sometimes you can even see something more of a yellowy brown. The other thing that you can see in that example there is you can see some example of wavy grain, which we're going to talk about next, which can be quite desirable from an appearance point of view, particularly when it's sanded and finished to a very high quality finish. So grain refers to the direction of the wood elements and varies according to the position the board occupied in the tree and the conversion method used to cut it out of the log, such as quarter sawn boards or back sawn boards. Now we're going to cover that in the next lecture as well. So we're going to go into that in some detail. Texture refers to variations in size, quality, and distribution of the cell types present in the wood. So some timbers are very finely textured timbers, and some timbers have a very coarse texture. And of course, there's everything in between. Now, when we talk about texture, you will tend to find the size of individual cells, also the size of individual vessels or pores will have a lot of, influence in the actual texture of the timber. Figure is a term usually applied to timbers which possess unusual or attractive designs resulting from variations in colour, grain, and texture. The Blackwood image adjacent contains figure in the form of wavy grain. Now, wavy grain in the context of Blackwood is usually caused in the tree where it's growing in a fairly windy place or a part of the tree that is affected by wind. And so it's actually the motion of the wind on the tree over time that causes this wavy grain. And like I said, it's very desirable from an appearance point of view. It can sometimes be challenging from a workability point of view. Working qualities refer to the ease or difficulty of sawing, planing, chiseling, carving, shaping, bending, turning, gluing, and nailing, and can be impacted by the following mechanical properties. So there's quite a lot there, and not all of them are relevant for every piece of timber in every situation, because it depends on what you, as the designer and the maker, are doing with the timber. So for example, if you are going to bend it using either steam bending or laminated bending or something like that, then there would be some features that might be relevant to that technique. But if you are going to be carving it, maybe then other features, other qualities are relevant. Okay, so now we're going to look at mechanical properties. So the density of the timber depends on the size of the cells, the thickness of the cell walls, and the amount of lignin, gums, and resins present in the cell walls. Hardness and softness are closely related to density because they also vary due to the size of the cell and the thickness of the cell wall, as well as the chemical inclusions. Hardness and softness impact workability as well as the proposed use of the timber. And one of the things to consider, particularly if you're designing furniture, is both with density and hardness. Obviously, we're talking about the workability, how easy it is to work with or how hard it is, but also think about the weight of the piece of furniture in the end. Sometimes we can choose certain timbers, for aesthetic reasons, but they're so dense they can be really difficult to work with, and you end up with a piece of furniture at the end that's excessively heavy and difficult to move around. Durability is defined as the ability to resist decay, borers, termites, and weathering. And I suppose the best example of durability is the picture of this jetty here. If you're going to use timber to make a jetty or a wharf, you're really going to be thinking about finding very, very durable timbers for that task. But also, if you were designing a piece of furniture that needed to be outside or was in a particular context, in contact with the ground, you would also be thinking about durability. Strength refers to several mechanical properties, and it is directly related to the type of cell structure, size of cells, thickness of cell walls, the amount of lignin, and the direction of growth. And again, strength, if you're going to be making something that is of, particularly challenging, and I've put in here this bridge. strength is an issue, but it's still an issue when it comes to designing with designing furniture as well. So for example, you might choose a timber with very high strength characteristics because it means that you can use less of it to achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve in terms of designing with timber. So you might then be able to make a piece of furniture that is incredibly light but is still quite strong. Shrinkage or timber movement is another important consideration. And we're going to talk about this both in timber conversion in this week, but also next week. We're going to talk about it in terms of how we can incorporate our understanding of timber movement into how we design with timber and some very specific techniques that we can use.